Hello, my name is Sam Schiffer with the PMBF program here at UCF. Today I'm joined by Dr. Konstantin Ash. Dr. Ash is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science, specializing in comparative politics and international relations. Specifically, he focuses on explaining participation in political conflict and violence, ranging from protests and riots to insurgencies and terrorism, and using these findings to make group-level quantitative inferences, particularly with respect to conflict in the Middle East, North Africa, and the broader Islamic world. Dr. Ash has agreed to discuss his research as it pertains to one of the most well-known conflicts in the world right now, the Syrian civil war. Dr. Ash, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you please provide us with an overview of the situation on the ground in Syria today and how it's changed over the recent months?
Well, to get a sense of the situation in Syria, it's best to go back to maybe about a year to where the conflict was essentially a four-pronged conflict. We had the government that was in control of Damascus, Aleppo, parts of the northwest of the country, the rebels that still remain, the Free Syrian Army, and Tahrir al-Sham, the Islamist rebel groups that had some influence and control in the northwest and parts of the south. The Kurds and whatever Syrian rebel allies that they had cobbled together, who were nominally in control of most of the northeast of the country and moving down, and ISIS that was in control of the bulk of the Syrian desert, which, if you look at a map of Syria, kind of makes up most of the geographic space, but doesn't make up most of the populated places, along with the cities of Raqqa and parts of the city of Deir ez-Zor. So that's changed in that ISIS has lost a lot of territory. Raqqa is basically under siege by the Kurds. The Syrian government has swept in and taken over a lot of that desert space, and ISIS as a territorial entity has become, to some extent, they still exist as a territorial entity, mind you, but they have become marginalized to a great extent, much as they have in Iraq. In Iraq, they basically control two major cities, Hawija and Tal Afar, and that might change in the next few months. So it's really the fall of ISIS that's really been the main event that has happened. Obviously, Aleppo falling late last year was an important event as well, but that hasn't really materialized into a lot of movement on the Northwestern Front as of yet.
Right. You've recently published a paper discussing the linkages between leaders and the formation of pro-government militias. Much of the world sees the Syrian conflict as one that's between an autocrat's professional army and various rebel groups. How have pro-government militias played a role in the conflict in Syria?
So it's actually a good example of where pro-government militias do a lot to help the Syrian regime stay in power, and did a lot at the beginning of the conflict. So Bashar Assad's army is not necessarily a group that's cohesive. It had a lot of defections at the beginning of the conflict because a lot of the conscripts were Sunni Arabs. A lot of the leadership, the generals, were Alawites or members of other minorities. So ultimately, the Syrian government had to resort to find a more loyal source of soldiers. These aren't necessarily more professionally trained soldiers. They already had that in the Shabiha. So this was a primarily Alawite militia. These guys had like big muscles and steroids. They were able to, in 1999, actually defend Bashar Assad against a coup attempt, or actually Hafez Assad, his father, against a coup attempt in the Alawite regions. But this is a group of basically roided up thugs that perform a bunch of violent acts. They aren't necessarily well trained. But as the conflict developed, the Syrian government sort of unleashed them on protesters, unleashed them on the nascent rebels, and over time has developed the Shabiha into a more coherent sort of support force for the Syrian army, which again isn't super reliable.
Sure.
And in addition to that, there's actually been movement to create other pro-government militias out of other minority groups. So the Shabiha are primarily Alawite Muslims. This is the core of Bashar Assad's government. Most top officials are Alawites. That doesn't mean every Alawite supports Bashar Assad or anything like that, but it does mean that to extract loyalty, Assad draws on certain individuals from the Alawite community, gives them high positions in his government, and they basically know that, well, if Assad were to lose power, we're probably not going to get the same high-ranking positions in a new government where members of a minority were not necessarily the best people to do this job.
Right.
And it's not very lucrative to hire us again if like the Sunni Arab militias that are currently the rebels take over. But at the same time, there are other groups that have also formed pro-government militias in support of the government. The Druze have Jaish al-Muwaddin, which is a group from the southern Sueda region primarily. Christians have their own militias that also act in support of the government. And basically, these groups aren't, again, coherent fighting forces, but what they are ways of extracting loyalty from civilian populations in a given region, and they're ways of providing some support and potentially even providing some spying and intelligence or recon on the Free Syrian Army, or not, the actual Syrian army, which is prone to these defections, again, because the conscripts are still primarily Sunnis,
right?
Even though the rebels are also primarily Sunnis.
Right, because you talk in your paper about some of these pro-government militias. They can be made of criminals, football hooligans, weightlifters, general societal outcasts.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a trade-off between professionalism and loyalty that the Assad regime seems to be okay with.
Yeah, absolutely. And these groups technically have some aspects of criminalism, hooliganism. The Shabiha, if you care to look at their Instagram pages, tend to be very, very muscly guys,
right.
And they're clearly, taking a lot of steroids and things like that.
Sure. You don't see a lot of professional armies with Instagram pages these days.
Well, actually, that's how they found out Russian troops were in Ukraine, as they kept posting it on social media.
That's interesting. In Syria, the Assad family has always relied on its own Alawite community and has made other strategic alliances with communities inside of Syria. One of your hypotheses is that leaders are more likely to form linkages with ethnically or religiously oriented militia groups if the leader is facing external threats from outside of the ruling coalition. Mm-hmm. Could you explain how Bashar al-Assad assessed external threats?
So to him, I think it was very straightforward in 2011 when the rebellion started. So the rebellion starts when a bunch of officers from the Syrian army defect, make the Free Syrian Army after these protests have been going on for about 4 months, and they, from Turkey, use it as a base to start taking over territory in the country, drawing in other militant groups, eventually drawing in foreign fighters and people like that. But ultimately, it was a homegrown rebellion that sort of became compromised over time with the introduction of foreign fighters. Some people actually say Assad facilitated this to try to make the movement seem more radical and try to get more Sunnis on his side. That's beside what you're asking. So basically, to Assad, he already had this militia, and the militia was actually in place beforehand to really protect the Assad families, or protect Bashar and Hafez Assad specifically, because they would have actual rebellions against them from within their family. So Hafez Assad's brother, Bashar Assad's father's brother, Bashar Assad's uncle, had rebelled and attempted a coup in the 80s. Supporters of that brother continued to sporadically kind of revolt. There were these Latakia protests, and they were not put down by the army. They were put down in 1999 by the actual Shabiha. So the Shabiha have been long defenders of specifically Hafez Assad, and later Bashar Assad, after Hafez Assad died's rule. But over time, they sort of grew, as in 2011, you see the sectarian nature of the rebellion. Assad sort of emphasized the Alawite nature of the Shabiha. They never really were. They were composed of Alawites, but they never were like a super pro-Alawite militia until you see this. So I don't know if that hypothesis necessarily applies here, because the Shabiha have been around for a while, but it definitely helped that they were from the same ethnic group, because you can emphasize the fact that, well, not only are these other people fighting Sunnis, but they're also these extremists, foreign fighters. Again, there's some theories out there that Assad actively invited foreign fighters in, released Islamists from prison specifically so they would join the rebellion and make it more radical. Things to make the opponent seem more radical, to hope that more people defect to your side. You're seen as more rational and a better actor. That may not be normatively the case, but it is an attempt.
Yeah, definitely. The United States, among other nations, have voiced support for a Syria without Assad. How do these threats shape the behavior of the Assad regime? How does Assad's threat assessment conform to your theory in regard to religious or ethnic militias? Concerning the United States threat in general, has that influenced his linkages with these militias any more than any other country? as a threat?
I mean, so currently I don't think the U.S. threat is just very credible. The U.S., bombed that one air base after a chemical attack in April, but then there wasn't really any follow-up about that. So I think the Assad regime took from that, hey, we can't really openly use chemical weapons anymore, but not necessarily that there is a threat that the U.S. would stage a massive air campaign to overthrow them anytime in the near future. Now, that all may change in 2 years when ISIS is no longer a territorial force. It all may change if the Assad regime is fighting against Kurdish militias, which are U.S. allies. If it goes back to a period where they're more clearly the bad guys,
right,
then certainly. But yeah, I think in 2011, 2012, when the U.S. had already carried out strikes against Libya and overthrown Gaddafi, and there was some sense that, well, maybe Assad is next, when the president of Russia was Dmitry Medvedev, and there was sort of as supportive of Bashar Assad as his successor, or predecessor and successor, Vladimir Putin were, then there was probably concern, and maybe that influenced some more reliance on pro-government militias, not just the Shabiha, but also the other groups.
Right.
But I'm not entirely sure that this would apply now, just because after 2013, things really did change. And militarily, it really was worthwhile to use either pro-government militias or foreign forces. There are a lot of Iranian Republican Guard fighting with the Syrian army. Hezbollah is fighting with the Syrian army. Now aspects of the Russian military are supporting the Syrian army. So it's really a issue for the Syrian army that they're not a very competent military force in their own right, and that they need all this support, and they're not an especially loyal force, so they need all this backup to
right.
Materialize. So I'm not sure if we can kind of tease out that effect in a foreign.
Right. Another paper you published looked at the effect democracy can have on some domestic terrorism. Mm-hmm. Does this theory apply to Syria? How did the autocratic behavior of the Assad regime lead to civil war?
Mm-hmm. So there's kind of two different questions. So the paper kind of actually talks about how insurgent groups use terrorism as a way of projecting their power in a conflict. And so there are actually examples in that paper from Syria. So Syria has these two insurgent groups that I briefly mentioned, or two main insurgent groups that I briefly mentioned. The Free Syrian Army, which is an amalgamation of a bunch of smaller groups, and what used to be the Nusra Front, which is now Tahrir al-Sham. They changed their name and joined in with some other Islamist groups. But basically, there's a large spectrum of groups there. And there's a lot of different theories out there as to why insurgent groups actually use terrorism. Because, again, they have guns, they have territory, they are holding it, they're fighting the military. Why go out and also send out, like, suicide bombers somewhere? Some of it might be to punish the civilian population, I posited. Some of it might be to try to expand their territory by destabilizing a particular space. And in Syria, it's actually pretty hard to tell, because even if an attack takes place in Damascus, it could take place to punish a certain civilian population from supporting the rebels, but there are also rebel enclaves in Damascus suburbs. So they could be operationally trying to destabilize the military and make the military look as not a particularly credible source of security, and hoping that they would move in. So there was a lot of actual terrorism at the beginning of the war, that Nusra Front and other Islamist groups would send suicide bombers to assassinate certain religious leaders that were in support of the regime. This one religious leader, Said al-Bouti, who was the head of the Damascene Ulama, this religious organization of Sunni clerics, was assassinated. He was a close friend of the Assad family for a long time. Obviously, that angered certain people in the rebel movement, so he was taken out. There were actually militarily operative attacks. A good chunk of the cabinet of the Syrian government was taken out in a suicide attack. So you could kind of infer from individual attacks what these groups are trying to do, but it's sort of a dual effect here. It's hard to tell in Syria whether they're trying to punish the civilian population, or they're trying to operationally destabilize the military, destabilize the government, and move into a particular territory. I think it was just more of the latter in the beginning of the conflict. Nowadays, we really don't see too much, I don't think, suicide attacks or other terrorist attacks by the Nusra Front, Tahrir al-Sham, or the Free Syrian Army, most likely because they are at a low level. They're something like IEDs or something like that against the Syrian army or against Russian elements that are supporting them or Iranian elements that are supporting them. So these seem more like these destabilization tactics to try to take over territory. Whether they're working or not, it's not necessarily the case. But that paper also kind of has an effect that, over time, groups learn that just attacking the capital, attacking the leadership, and trying to punish the regime doesn't really work. It just creates a garrison effect where individuals actually feel like more threatened and more emboldened to go after the rebels than they did before. So these small attacks might work better.
All right. Why has the violence in Syria continued for such a long period of time, for the most part without any let-up, unlike many of the other Arab Spring nations that we saw in 2011, like Tunisia, Libya, stuff like that? What makes the Syrian model unique, and how does it mirror other ethnic or religious conflicts?
So Syria is sort of unique in the Arab Spring cases, but not entirely. So we have Yemen, that's still an ongoing civil war with tons of foreign intervention and lots of different parties. Yemen, I think, gets just less press out there because there isn't a flow of refugees from Yemen. Both major powers aren't involved in Yemen, whether it's Russia or the U.S., really on either side. But I think what makes Syria such a prolonged civil war is the fact that there is this role of identity in these conflicts, and there wasn't really a clear way of displacing the leader. So in Libya, the conflict was fairly bloody. I mean, 20,000 people were killed in 6 months. But the conflict was then over when Gaddafi was displaced. Ultimately, the conflict has actually restarted and is still going on for 3 years. So I think these conflicts ultimately emerge when there is some kind of dictatorial presence in power for a very long time that's keeping a lid on tensions between certain communities, or actively exacerbating those tensions to stay in power. Ultimately, when those tensions boil over, in the case of Syria, we can say they boiled over because Bashar Assad deliberately stoked these interreligious divisions at the time of the protests, and that led to increasingly Sunni rebels fighting against increasingly Alawite and Druze and Christian pro-government supporters and sort of a Kurdish enclave on the side. So if those divisions hadn't been sort of deliberately stoked during the protest phase, I don't think we would have seen as long of a conflict. There would have been more room for settlement. But because there was this sort of interreligious community resentment between these groups, it makes it harder to come to an agreement. It makes it more likely that each side is sort of scared of what the other is going to do if there is a unilateral victory, or even if there is a peace settlement where somebody doesn't quite get as much power as somebody else. There's a risk that, well, if you get 60% and I get 40%, you're going to use your 60% to crush me, and they'll have nothing.
Right. And I'm curious if the conflict in Syria has lasted so long because of these external influences. You talk about Iran, you talk about Hezbollah, you talk about Russia, even the United States to some degree. Do you think that has continued to stoke the conflict longer than other Arab Spring nations who didn't see so much external involvement?
Well, actually, yeah, the external involvement, I think, is playing a major role in Libya and Yemen as well, because ultimately there is research that says if you have external backers to your rebel group, or you have, in particular, your rebel group, there's not much that says about the government, but it probably applies to the government as well, you're less accountable to the people on the ground. And if the people on the ground really want the conflict to end, and you're getting money from abroad, you're getting encouragement from abroad, you need to absolutely win or nothing, you're less encouraged to actually settle in the conflict. So it makes it more likely that the only possible outcome is for one side to militarily defeat the other. And when all sides are sort of supported by foreign powers, that also makes it more difficult. There's always going to be some flow of weapons coming in.
Right.
And you see this sort of in Libya as well. There's a 3-sided civil war in Libya, also with Islamists, also with parties backed by sort of moderate Islamist regimes. Well, let's rephrase that. Regimes that support political Islam versus regimes that support more traditional political interpretations. Saudi Arabia on one side, Qatar and Turkey on the other side. You see it in Yemen, where it's more sort of a mirror image of Syria, where you have Houthi rebels who are a sect of Shia Islam supported by primarily Iran and the technically government in charge that's primarily Sunni, that's supported by primarily Saudi Arabia. So you have sort of mirror images here. Again, you don't have these local elements that can talk to each other and say, okay, we are to some extent going to hash this out. We've talked before. We have had these relationships before the conflict started. Maybe we can work to build on them again. You have foreign influences that say, well, we want absolute victory or we want nothing. And oftentimes in regions where there's mountains, there's challenges to wiping out entire insurgencies, there's weaknesses in domestic militaries, there's weaknesses in foreign militaries. In the case of the Saudi intervention, you have a lot of problems in actually finding that military victory. So the conflicts kind of go on forever without any kind of settlement.
Right. And with a new administration, or newer administration in the White House, and kind of renewed interest in the region, everyone's thinking, what is President Trump going to do? He announced his policy on Afghanistan last night. But in regards to Syria, in your opinion, what kind of result can the United States hope for in the country?
Well, yeah, so the administration's policy seems to be pretty much the same as Obama's policy, as far as I can tell, of just supporting the Kurds and not particularly fighting with the Syrian government and hoping that over time ISIS is eroded. So there hasn't been really any kind of substantial policy change there. But in terms of what the best outcome for the U.S. would be, I mean, it's difficult to say because none of these groups are necessarily supportive of American interests. The Syrian government is self-interested to a major extent, but also backed by current antagonists of the U.S. in the foreign policy arena, whether it's Iran or Russia. The rebels are primarily Islamist. There are very few sort of the pro-Western rebels that started out the conflict. So if they were to win over the capital, if they were to wipe out Bashar Assad, I think that would create a lot of political instability in the country and also not be something that U.S. foreign policymakers would be happy with.
Right.
And then finally, the Kurds are probably, at least they say they are the most pro-Western side. They are secular, they're nationalist, but they, one, are incapable of winning the war in the entire country, and two, have sort of the potential to become victims of their own success, because currently they hold far more territory than there are actually Kurds in the country. They hold a lot of territory that are Arab villages. If they win over Raqqa, they'll hold an Arab city, basically a population of non-Kurdish residents might exceed Kurdish residents in the areas they control, and that becomes a problem because it could potentially lead to conflict either with the Syrian government or future Syrian rebel administration that A, don't like it that Kurds are in charge of these Arab rebel territories, and potentially because Kurdish military forces, the YPG, the People's Protection Brigades, have been known for some atrocities, ethnic cleansing, to try to move Arabs out into Turkey, actually. So having that kind of thing take place at a more massive scale would, I think, provoke conflict potentially. So I don't think there's a good solution to this conflict right now. Maybe somebody can think of something later.
Right.
But that's probably the best we can hope for.
Right, and definitely a situation that continues to unfold. Well, Dr. Ash, thank you very much for being with us today. That was Dr. Ash, Assistant Professor in the Political Science Department here at UCF. And for the PMBF program, I'm Sam Schiffer. Thank you very much for listening.